The Soviets accomplished a great deal while reconquering the territories occupied by the Nazis in Operation Barbarossa and ultimately driving them back to Berlin, where they finally planted the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. However, many myths exist surrounding the Soviet Union and the Red Army, downplaying their involvement in the Second World War. The vast majority of these myths try to portray the Soviet Union in a bad light, or, while acknowledging some of its accomplishments, try to diminish its contribution toward Allied victory and the hard-earned glory its soldiers paid for in blood. In spite of their immense contribution, it's not untrue that Russians, and Soviets in general, are portrayed as caricaturesque and rough-edged, if not outright demonized by most Western media.
I must break you.
And although anti-Soviet sentiment would not be openly expressed during World War II, it would resume right afterwards. Obviously, there was the ideological rivalry between the liberal democracies of the West and the Soviet Union, which was trying to institutionalize and export its communist ideals. But this rivalry ran far deeper, to the point of open antagonism, as the Western powers, including the United States and even Australia and Canada, had fought the Red Army in the past, namely in the Russian Civil War, after the new Bolshevik government of Russia withdrew from World War I. That's why analysing the interwar period is important when trying to understand the events which unfolded in World War II. In this video, we're going to shed some light on some of the myths of the Soviet Union by doing just that. The first myth we're going to analyse is that all Soviet officers shot their own soldiers in the back if they retreated or tried to flee. Although the Red Army did have a history of using barrier troops or blocking units to prevent soldiers from deserting or retreating without authorization, the practice of shooting their own soldier hardly ever happened. In 1918, Leon Trotsky, who was the People's Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs at the time, allegedly ordered Mikhail Tukhachevsky, commander of the First Army, to station barrier troops behind unreliable Red Army infantry regiments with orders to shoot them if they tried to desert or retreat. In the same year, Trotsky commissioned additional barrier troops for attachment to each infantry formation in the Red Army, saying, "It is absolutely essential that we have at least an embryonic network of blocking units and that we work out a procedure for bringing them up to strength and deploying them." However, this was during the Russian Civil War, and the practice of shooting their own men in the back did not become even remotely common. The concept of barrier troops was reintroduced on a large scale again in World War II as a countermeasure to reports of units disintegrating in battle and high desertion rates. The People's Commissariat of Defense issued a directive establishing mobile barrier troops composed of People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs personnel tasked with guarding roads, rail stations and forest and catching deserters and suspicious people. Later, with the deterioration of the situation during the German offensive of 1941, the barrier troops were used once again, tasked with preventing the unauthorized withdrawal of Red Army troops from the front line. According to a letter sent to Stalin's Commissar for Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Beria, from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 to December of the same year, only 1.5% of the soldiers that were detained by the barrier troops were sentenced to death. Barrier troops had detained 657,364 servicemen during this time. Of the detainees, 632,486 were reformed into units and sent back to the front, while 25,878 were arrested. Ultimately, only 10,201 were sentenced to death and shot. In July 1942, with Order Number 227, Stalin introduced a harsh no-retreat policy with the slogan, "Not one step back," which was popularized in the war. The practice of shooting their own men in the back was not as widespread as many believe, as many officers would rather send the soldiers back into the front than shoot them down. After all, they were in need of as many men as they could get. According to an internal list of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs dated October 1942, approximately 15,649 soldiers were detained by barrier troops while fleeing the front line of Stalingrad from August 1st, 1942 to October 15th, 1942. Of these, 14,833 were returned to their units, 244 were imprisoned, 218 were sent to penal companies, and 42 to penal battalions, while only 278 were actually shot. By October 1942, barrier troops were used less and less, as the balance of the war slowly turned in the USSR's favor. Finally, by October 1944, barrier troops were officially disbanded by Stalin's Order Number 349. The next myth that we're going to analyze is that the Red Army was quantity over quality. German generals and propaganda started the myth that German soldiers fought against hordes of Soviet troops which came in red waves. This, however, just was not true. By the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Soviets had 2,680,000 soldiers stationed on its provinces west of the Urals, while the Germans attacked with a force of 3,767,000. The rest of the Soviet forces were stationed in its far east provinces. The balance of forces started to shift in the Soviets' favor from December 1941 onwards, with the arrival of Soviet reinforcements and heavy German losses. With the arrival of said reinforcements, the Soviet army managed to maintain its size, while the Germans just couldn't replace their lost soldiers and started to slowly lose ground. It's true that by 1941, the Soviet Union fielded the largest land and air force in the world. Nevertheless, this alone would not deter Hitler's publicly announced plan to invade and colonize Eastern Europe. Although the Soviet Union boasted the largest air force, it was completely unprepared for the war. The Soviets had invested most of their money on long-range bomber planes, and their fighters were obsolete and unable to engage the much more modern Luftwaffe aircraft. This allowed for the Luftwaffe to virtually annihilate the Soviet Air Force during the first few days of Operation Barbarossa. According to the Luftwaffe's reports, over 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the first day, while over 3,100 were destroyed in the first 3 days. On the other hand, a Soviet document recorded the loss of 3,922 Soviet aircraft in the first 3 days. This secured the Third Reich's air superiority over the whole European theatre. It also allowed the Luftwaffe to uncontestedly support the Wehrmacht's advance with air raids on artillery positions, communication centres, and supply and weapons depots. Another reason why Operation Barbarossa was so devastating for the Soviet Union was the fact that the Soviet Union and its military had just gone through a purge. Of the 5 original marshals of the USSR, only 2 remained in service. This should give you a solid idea of the state the Red Army was in when Operation Barbarossa was launched in June 1941. Almost all of the Red Army's command lines had been replaced. Not only this, but valuable veteran officers were also purged from the military in favor of inexperienced ones, chosen for political reasons rather than experience or qualifications. This completely crippled the Red Army's decision-making abilities and ability to pass on orders and carry out commands. However, the more than capable Soviet soldiers fought with tooth and nail to hold on to their homelands for as long as they could while awaiting reinforcements from the Russian Far East. Unlike many Western armies, the Red Army did not train elite units. The Soviet government had abolished elite units from their army, namely the Imperial Guard, as they were reminiscent of the aristocratic ways of Imperial Russia. The Red Army had also abolished all officer and general ranks and replaced them with a system of positional ranks during the revolution. However, they started to re-adopt officer and general ranks in 1935. Similarly, Guard units re-emerged in 1941, in the wake of Hitler's nasty surprise. Named after the Imperial Guard, Guard units did not receive any special training, although they did get better equipment. Instead, Guard status was an honorific title bestowed upon units that had proven their bravery and ferocity in previous battles. Their name was the only thing that the Red Army's Guard units and Imperial Russia's Imperial Guard had in common. Guard units were like any other units, and their status was due to their merit, not their social class. In the end, it would be Soviet soldiers' bravery and determination in defending their homes, coupled with good logistics, that finally gave the USSR the upper hand. By December of 1941, the Soviet Union had mustered an army of around 1.1 million men, giving them a slight numerical advantage over the Germans. Then, a war of attrition started, and the Soviets took advantage of the harsh winter conditions. The Soviet counterattack finally ended the Third Reich's hope of conquering Moscow and gaining a rapid victory, just like they had against the French. As usual, we saved what we considered to be one of the biggest myths about the Soviet Union for last, that the Soviet Union had an early alliance with the Third Reich. And though there is some truth to the foundations on which this myth is based, there was never an actual alliance between these two states. Their relations were always rather tense, and they viewed themselves as competing economies at best, and as each other's ideological, if not actual nemesis at the very worst. Actually, even before the Soviet Union entered World War II, the two countries had already been not only ideologically opposed but materially opposed as well, as they both supported different parties in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets sided with the Second Spanish Republic forces while the Third Reich sided with Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. The Third Reich provided air support to the nationalist forces, support that was instrumental in Franco's eventual victory over Republican forces. This myth mainly revolves around the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is what the treaty actually was, a non-aggression treaty. It stipulated that no signatory party would attack the other, nor ally itself with or aid an enemy of the other. However, as it would be revealed during the Nuremberg trials, the pact contained a secret clause through which Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe between German and Soviet spheres of influence. What this means is that they drew a map detailing in which direction each state could expand without harming the other's declared interests. The Soviet Union is indeed guilty of both appeasing the Nazis' expansionist ambitions and benefiting from them by annexing parts of Poland. However, the rest of the European powers, and even Poland itself, are guilty of the same sin. Poland had in fact similarly signed a non-aggression pact with Germany back in 1935, and in the aftermath of the signing of the Munich Agreement, otherwise known as the Munich Betrayal, when Hitler decided that the Sudetenland was not enough and took control of the whole country, the Polish decided to have their piece of the pie and grab Solzy for themselves. When humans get together in large numbers, bad things can happen. War is all fear and hate, and World War II remains the worst war we've ever seen. I don't think any belligerent state was without its atrocities and war crimes. Even the kindest of us can devolve into monsters, but it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you that the Soviet Union was right up there with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. In this video, we're going to outline the atrocities of the USSR and its blood red army in the Second World War. The Soviet Union engulfed a whole lot of land before, during, and after the Second World War.
It's free real estate.
And one of its favorite things to do with the people living in that land was to boot them out of it. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and countries in those war-torn years, and many of those unfortunate souls were thrown deep into the USSR, as far as Siberia, which was basically a death sentence. Between 1939 and 1941, for instance, some 1.5 million people were deported out of Poland by the Soviets. This particular deportation was on a massive scale, but it happened elsewhere too. In Estonia, for instance, almost 11,000 people were deported by the Soviets in just 3 days, mostly in train cars designed for moving cattle. The Soviets deported people from their own territory too, such as farmers who owned anything over 8 acres of land whom they considered to be a threat to Bolshevism, well-off Greek minorities, of which some 50,000 were booted out, and persons of Finnish descent living in the part of the USSR known back then as Ingria, of which some 76% had received the boot as early as 1939. On this latter example, after the end of the Continuation War, the Soviet Union was supposed to send the Ingrian Finns back to Ingria, but instead they forced them to settle in Siberia and Central Russia and Asia. While many deportees were simply ejected from their homes and countries, others were thrown into prisons, forced to carry out manual labor, or forced into military service. Prisoners, especially political prisoners, all through the Soviet Union and its occupation zones, were tortured to death for intelligence purposes, and sometimes just for entertainment. We'll get into military prisoners of war soon, but for now, we're mostly talking about civilian prisoners, of whom many were women and children. From Poland, for example, the Soviet NKVD took hundreds of thousands of political prisoners to camps in the USSR, where they cut off their fingers, ears, and noses, scalded them with boiling water, bound them together with barbed wire, and shot them to death or simply left them to die of starvation and exposure, among other things. Others were delivered to gulags, which were Soviet forced labor camps. Gulags were torture in themselves, and few deported to them ever made it back home. In the years immediately after the war, hundreds of thousands of German civilians were deported to the gulags in the Soviet Union, where it's estimated that more than 200,000 of them perished due to starvation and disease. Instead of being imprisoned or worked to death, others still were forced to spill their blood in the Red Army throughout the war. In 1941, around 34,000 Estonians were added to the ranks of the Red Army, and only about 30% of them actually survived the war. Between 1940 and 1941, some 150,000 Poles were sent to war under Soviet flags against Finland and Germany. These are just a few of many examples. For other European civilians, death came more swiftly. Sometimes, the NKVD and their Red Army muscle found it easier to execute political prisoners on the spot, while other civilians became casualties of Soviet scorched earth policies. In Kautla, Estonia, on the 24th of July 1941, for instance, Soviet destruction battalions set civilian farms and farmhouses on fire with their occupants still inside, and tortured other civilians to death, reducing the village's population by 30 in just one day. On the 26th of January 1945, in the Polish village of Prashovice, the Red Army massacred some 70 civilians, including women, children, and infants, some simply for trying to put out their burning homes. In Nemersdorf, East Prussia, on the 21st of October 1944, the Red Army massacred 74 German civilians and some 50 French and Belgian POWs, though not before torturing them for their own entertainment. According to a Wehrmacht officer who later discovered the scene, the Soviets had nailed some civilians to barn doors in cruciform positions. Again, these are just a few of many, many examples. Generally, Soviet destruction battalions plundered, murdered, and razed civilian settlements to the ground, just as high-up command had ordered them to do. This brings us to our next and most vulgar point. The Red Army raped hundreds of thousands of women and young girls before, during, and after the Second World War. In Poland alone, it's estimated that more than 100,000 females were raped by Red Army soldiers, leading to a countrywide STD pandemic which affected about 10% of the population after the war. In Hungary, rape victim estimates vary from 5,000 to 200,000. Of course, this occurred all throughout Germany too, and especially around the Battle of Berlin. The number of German women raped by the Soviet soldiers has been estimated to be as high as 2 million, and it's also estimated that some 240,000 of these victims were killed in the act or after it. In the words of British military historian Anthony Beevor, it was the greatest phenomenon of mass rape in history, and no women from 8 to 80 years old were spared. Similar atrocities occurred after the war in Europe, during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, in which the Red Army soldiers raped and massacred thousands of Japanese women and children. As one witness reported it, the soldiers were permitted by their commanders to carry out, in his words, 3 days of rape and pillage on a newly captured city. So far, we've mostly covered the atrocities inflicted by the Red Army soldiers on civilians. But what about military personnel? All in all, the Soviets tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, many after they had been taken as POWs, and many almost immediately after they had surrendered. It's estimated that as many as 3 million German soldiers, for instance, were captured by the Soviets throughout the war, with more than 380,000 of them perishing in captivity. Others reported the German death toll as high as 1 million, which is more than 33% of all German soldiers that were captured. Many of these POWs succumbed to starvation, disease, exposure, previously inflicted wounds, and Red Army violence. The Soviets carried out soldier massacres too, with the Katyn massacre being among the most infamous. Between April and May 1940, the NKVD executed some 22,000 Polish military personnel, purported spies and saboteurs, land and factory owners, and other, in quotation marks, undesirables in Katyn Forest in Russia and Kalinin and Kharkiv prisons in Russia and the Ukraine. What makes this massacre so scandalous is that the USSR first blamed it on the Nazis and then, in 1990, admitted to it. As it turned out, unsurprisingly, Stalin himself had approved of the massacre. While not quite on the same scale as Katyn, between the 29th of December 1941 and New Year's Day of 1942, the Red Army executed up to 160 German soldiers in the Crimean port city of Feodosia. Here, the Soviets mutilated the helpless soldiers, threw them out of windows, and soaked them in cold water so they would slowly freeze to death. Across several Ukrainian towns in February 1943, the Red Army took 596 Axis personnel prisoner, of which 508 were military and 88 were civilian. Not just Germans, but Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, and fellow Ukrainians too. Just like in Feodosia, the Soviets mutilated them horrifically, cutting pieces off their body and stuffing them into their mouths before killing them. Pretty atrocious and grim, right? But what we mustn't forget is that the Soviets weren't the only ones who did stuff like this, and this video, of course, doesn't detail what the soldiers of other nations, namely Germany, did to the soldiers and civilians of the USSR. Not to say that revenge is an excuse. It isn't. During the Second World War, in just a few words, we'd say they were occupied hard. However, the reality of the situation was more complicated than that. In this video, we're going to give Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania some of the attention they deserve. Before things hit the fan in September of 1939, Estonia had declared itself neutral, along with Latvia and Lithuania. Little did Estonia know, however, that Stalin and Hitler would assign it to the Soviet sphere of influence under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact about a year later. With the pact signed and Poland crushed, the Soviets set their sights on Estonia, leveraging the Orzel incident to justify an unjust ultimatum. With Soviet warships and warplanes looming overhead, Estonia signed an agreement stipulating that the Soviets could set up military bases in Estonia and call on it for military support. They should have never let Stalin get his foot in the door. In June 1940, some 160,000 Red Army troops spilt out of said bases or otherwise invaded Estonia. While some Estonians put up a fight, the government ordered the military to stand down. The Soviets then took control of the government and proclaimed Estonia as part of the USSR. Over the next year, they arrested, deported, and killed thousands of Estonians. Of the 8,000 arrested in this time, more than 1/4 of them were killed inside Estonia, while the rest were sent to prison camps in Russia, where they suffered a far slower death. In 1940, the Soviets conscripted some 17,000 Estonians into the Red Army under the 22nd Territorial Rifle Corps, but many of these men defected to the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, and the unit was liquidated in September 1941. Additionally, around 40% of Estonia's naval fleet, which was out of port during the Soviet invasion, sailed into the arms of the British, who enlisted Estonian ships and sailors in the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine. On Operation Barbarossa, it proved disastrous for Estonia. As the Soviets retreated, they employed scorched earth tactics, murdering thousands of civilians and destroying as many as 13,500 buildings and more than 3,200 farms. Of the 33,000 Estonians the Soviets had conscripted into the Red Army at this point, not even half of them saw combat, and those who didn't were discarded into concentration camps and labor battalions. Many brave Estonians fought against the Soviets too, with most of these men conducting guerrilla operations under the Baltic partisan organization known as the Forest Brothers, which we'll get to later. While most Estonians were happy to see the Soviets go, they soon realized the Germans weren't their friends. They set about Germanizing Estonia, letting Germans in and booting so-called undesirables out. They also subjected Estonia to the Holocaust, exterminating almost 1/4 of its Jewish population. While some Estonians volunteered to fight in the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, most didn't want to. It wasn't until 1944 that the Germans picked up their conscription game, consolidating various Estonian units under the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, and bringing the number of Estonians fighting for Germany up to 70,000. This was in reaction to the turn of the tide of the Eastern Front. The Estonians and Germans staved off the Soviet counteroffensive for some time, but the Red Army ultimately retook Estonia, inspiring some 80,000 people to flee. The USSR literally dissolved before Estonia was in Estonian hands again, with the Russian Federation withdrawing from Estonia in 1994. Outside of Estonia, from 1942 to 1946, the Red Army also recruited ethnic Estonians into the USSR into the 8th Estonian Rifle Corps, which had grown to a strength of about 27,000 by late 1942. The Corps even fought against the aforementioned 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS at times, Estonians killing Estonians. All in all, Estonia lost around 25% of its 1.1 million strong population throughout the war. As we said earlier, Latvia started out neutral too. Also like Estonia, the Soviets forced Latvia into a pact which allowed the Red Army to station its troops on Latvian territory, beginning with some 25,000. Of course, once the Soviets had their foot in the door, they revealed their true intentions, demanding the entry of an unlimited number of troops. In June 1940, the Soviets marched in, took control of the government and annexed Latvia into the USSR. As with Estonia, they began Sovietizing it, arresting, deporting, and executing anyone who stood in their way. In 1940 alone, as many as 27,500 Latvians were arrested and as many as 50,000 lost their lives. Some 35,000 were deported, accounting for around 1.8% of the population. The Red Army also absorbed the Latvian army, ultimately turning it into the 24th Territorial Rifle Corps, though of the original 24,400 men in the corps, all but 3,000 either deserted or were arrested or shot. About a year after the Soviets had seized Latvia, the Germans drove them out and, like in Estonia, were welcomed with open arms. Again, Latvia's German liberators soon revealed their true nature, intending to Germanize Latvia by deporting or murdering up to 50% of its population, which was about 2 million at the time. Among the Latvians who were to be removed were the Jews, who accounted for around 70,000 of the 80,000 to 100,000 Latvian citizens killed under Nazi Germany's reign. What's worse is that some Latvians participated in the Holocaust, with the auxiliary police unit Aras Commando, for example, murdering as many as 26,000 Jews by itself. The Germans were much more successful at bringing Latvians into their army than their Soviet counterparts. Early in 1943, they started drafting them into the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, and by mid-1944, there were as many as 87,550 Latvians in the Latvian Legion of the SS and some 23,000 in Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Between 15 and 20% of them were volunteers. When the Soviets reversed the Eastern Front, they returned for Latvia as they did Estonia, occupying the state and subjecting its people to more arrests, deportations, and death. The Soviets also recreated Latvian Red Army units, mustering some 15,000 Latvians under the 130th Latvian Rifle Corps, which fought against Latvian SS units. Some 200,000 German troops held out in the region of Courland before surrendering to the Soviets, and among them were around 14,000 Latvian soldiers who joined the Germans in death or Soviet prison camps. Many of those who evaded the Soviets joined Latvian resistance movements, including the aforementioned Forest Brothers, and contested their occupation for decades. On resistance movements, various Latvian organizations resisted either the Soviets, Germans, or both during all three occupations. Some even worked with one foreign power to help defeat the other. The Latvian Central Council was an example of a pro-Latvian independence movement which fought for Latvia's interests alone, while many pro-Soviet resistance operated under the central staff of the partisan movement in Moscow. All in all, Latvia lost about 25% of its population throughout the war, and as with Estonia, the state wasn't back in Latvian hands until 1994. Unlike Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania was first assigned to Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, yet this was soon changed, and, as was customary, the Soviets coerced Lithuania into letting them accommodate some 20,000 troops there in October 1939. The Soviets then took control from the inside, let in more troops, and colored Lithuania red on the map. During this first occupation, Lithuanian partisans such as the Lithuanian Activist Front were active, but Lithuanians were still forced to fight in the Red Army, namely under the 16th and 29th Rifle Divisions. Many of these men deserted as soon as they could, though some Lithuanian communists chose to stay on and fight the Germans alongside other Lithuanians from elsewhere in the USSR. During Sovietization, between 20,000 and 30,000 Lithuanians were deported, many to labor camps in Central Asia. Around 12,000 were arrested as enemies of the people, and a further 17,000 were deported to Siberia in the lead up to the German invasion. As for the German invasion itself, it was met by some joint Soviet and Lithuanian resistance, while some anti-Soviet and pro-independence resistance movements worked to undermine the Soviets from the inside. Still, after taking some 3,400 casualties, the Germans successfully took and occupied the state. Having killed thousands of Lithuanians in the process, however, Lithuania wasn't quite so welcoming as the other two Baltic states. Unlike with Estonia and Latvia, no Lithuanian Waffen-SS unit was formed, and their resistance was generally more organized. Still, Lithuania took the full brunt of German occupation, with the Holocaust beginning within the first few days and as many as 120,000 Lithuanian Jews losing their lives by December 1941 alone. By the end of the war, that number grew as large as 195,000, accounting for 90 to 95% of the state's Jewish population. Tens of thousands of Lithuanians took part in the Lithuanian Holocaust or otherwise assisted their occupiers. Also, by June 1944, as many as 100,000 Lithuanians had been deported to Germany, where they undertook forced labor. Coordinated in part by the Lithuania partisan movement, Lithuanians, Poles, and even Soviets contested the Germans, but the Lithuanian partisans largely avoided violence at this time. When the Soviets returned, they actively contested resistance organizations by deporting as many as 120,000 people by 1953. This didn't wholly undo the Lithuanian resistance, however. The aforementioned Forest brothers continued to engage their occupiers until 1953, while non-violent resistance continued for decades beyond that. If the partisans were caught, they were tortured to death and their entire families may have been deported. Often, they exploded themselves with grenades to avoid capture. On the Forest brothers in general, at least 50,000 Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians lost their lives fighting foreign occupation throughout World War II, and up until they regained their independence in the early 1990s. Fun fact, Forest brother Jānis Pinups didn't come out of hiding until 1995. All in all, Lithuania lost over 1 million people between 1940 and 1953, which works out to be about a third of the state's pre-war population. It's well known that throughout the Second World War, the Germans were building a plethora of weird weapons they hoped might turn the tide. Not to be outdone by a man with a smaller mustache, Stalin went all in on crazy weapon designs too. Reflecting his focus on land and air warfare, the big man in Moscow greenlit a whole host of experimental weapons projects. By the end of the First World War, all the European armies had realized that tanks would be critical in the inevitable round 2. But how do you make your tanks better than everyone else's? The Russians threw their best German scientists at the problem and came up with the monstrous T-35. What made this tank superior? It had 5 turrets. It was also enormous, weighing 54 tons when loaded for battle. Obscenely expensive, the Soviets were forced to stop production in 1939 after they'd made 61 of these monsters. Gigantic, slow, and prone to breaking down, the T-35 had a terrible combat record. Some were thrown into chaotic defensive battles during the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa. This wasn't to halt the German advance, but to get rid of a vehicle most officers consider a total liability. The 1930s were the golden age of crazy Soviet weapons, and a major reason for this was resources. The rapidly industrializing Soviet Union was keen to manufacture everything using its nationally available materials. This worked great until Konstantin Kalinin of the Kharkiv Aviation Bureau asked for metal to build his massive experimental plane. The government gave him steel. Steel is pretty strong but also very heavy, so when Kalinin built his plane, the K-7, he had to add extra engines to get it off the ground. That meant increasing the wingspan to maximize lift too, and the project grew out of hand. The final prototype was 53 meters from wingtip to wingtip and weighed a whopping 38 tons. The behemoth needed 8 engines to get off the ground, but could deliver 112 paratroopers or drop 19 tons of bombs. During the K-7's initial set of test flights, the crew discovered the engines vibrated so much that they damaged the airframe. The engineers tried to fix this by shortening the tail booms, but this made the monster plane so unstable that it crashed on its next test flight, killing everyone on board. the project was scrapped. For most people, tanks and planes are two very different types of vehicles that don't share many design features, but the Soviets thought a little differently. Oleg Antonov, the famous aircraft designer, looked at a tank and decided he would make it fly. The idea was simple. Wings and a tail would be attached to a T-60 light tank, allowing it to glide. Then, this tank glider would be towed to its target by a TB-3 heavy bomber. When the tank crew were overhead their destination, they would glide the tank gently down to earth where they could support paratroopers right away. Antonov called it the A-40. While it seems crazy to us, for the Russians, airdropping tanks wasn't out of the question. The TB-3 bomber had successfully airdropped T-27 tankettes from a few meters above the ground during the 1940 Bessarabia campaign. If they were left in neutral, the T-27s could roll to a stop when they hit the ground. The problem was that the crews were dropped separately and often lost their tanks. Amazingly, the A-40 actually worked during its only test flight. After detaching from the bomber, the pilot landed safely, detached the wings, and drove the tank back to base. The bomber pilot, however, was not happy. He almost crashed trying to drag the immensely heavy vehicle into the air. Soviet heavy bombers were in short supply and more valuable than experimental flying tanks, so the project was shelved. The Soviet Union of the 1930s had some weapons projects that weren't necessarily crazy, just way ahead of their time. One of them was a naval hovercraft built by Vladimir Levkov. Using air cushion technology, Levkov wanted to build an exceptionally speedy attack craft for the Red Navy. In 1932, he built a 2.5 meter model and tested it successfully. This caught the eye of Stalin's Navy mates, and they had Levkov transferred to the Moscow Aviation Institute. With access to the institute's resources, Levkov quickly scaled up his plans and completed the first prototype hovercraft in 1935. It was named the L-1 and could reach speeds of 60 knots on a calm sea. 2 years later, he built the upgraded L-5. This prototype really impressed the admirals. It had a cabin for the pilot and a mechanic, a machine gun turret, a troop compartment, torpedoes, and depth charges. It was fast too, with a top speed of 70 knots. The L-5's only drawback was its engines. They often stalled if water got into the intake, which happened in even marginally rough seas. Levkov spent a few years working on a better design, but it was too late. The German invasion forced him to relocate to Siberia, and Stalin demanded he worked on a new project, troop transport gliders. Despite its early success, the project was over and the hovercrafts were scrapped. This next vehicle is a classic example of a Russian solution to a Russian problem. I imagine the development went like this. Comrade Igor, how to move soldier quickly in deep snow in middle of glorious Soviet winter. Ah, Comrade Ivan, it is simple. We make sled from old car and old plane. But what if we must kill fascists too? We attach machine gun. The resulting vehicle was named the Aerosan and was extremely successful. There were many iterations, but the basic design was a two-man cockpit with a gunner up front and the pilot behind, sitting on 4 skis and powered by an aircraft or car engine spinning a propeller. The Aerosan was set low to the ground, giving it exceptional maneuverability on ice and snow. In snowy conditions that stopped trucks and tanks, the Aerosan could zip around easily, carrying out reconnaissance, transmitting messages, and raiding enemy supply lines. One of the most successful Aerosani was the RF-8, which was used against the Finns during the Winter War and the Germans during the freezing winters on the Eastern Front. Before the adoption of the aforementioned T-38 heavy tank, the Soviets experimented with plans for an even bigger monster, the T-42 super heavy tank. Like the T-35, this behemoth had 5 separate turrets, one armed with a 107mm howitzer, 2 with 45mm anti-tank guns, and 2 with 7.62mm machine guns. It needed a crew of 14 to 15 to operate and would have weighed over 100 tons. The design team quickly ran into a problem. Even with their German engineering expertise, they couldn't develop an engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. It was 1932 and an engine capable of powering their monster tank was still 6 years away from being invented. To remedy this, the design team decided just to use 2 1,000 horsepower engines. This made the already massive tank even bigger. The final T-42 was such a huge target for bombing planes that it needed to keep 2 machine gun turrets reserved as anti-aircraft guns, something no other tank needed. The design eventually got so massive that the Soviets canned the project. The T-42 never left the drawing board. What's the best way to increase the range of your aircraft? The Germans thought better engines, the Brits thought better fuel, and the Americans thought more planes. But the Soviets had a different idea, bolting several planes together. Called the Zveno project, Soviet designers wanted their heavy bombers to be able to carry several fighter planes and deploy them from the air. The idea was that fighters could be deployed at further ranges, escort the bombers, and carry heavier payloads. Early designs had fighter planes fixed to the top of the bombers, but tests proved that getting them up there was very difficult, so they bolted them under the wings instead. Shockingly, the crazy idea worked pretty well. Testing showed that the Zveno SPB was the most practical. A TB3 heavy bomber would take off with 2 stumpy Polikarpov I-16s under the wings. The I-16s would detach and then dive bomb their target, returning to base under their own power. In July 1940, Zveno SPBs of the Black Sea Fleet Air Force bombed an oil depot in occupied Romania. The raid was successful, and between July and August, 30 Zveno SPB raids were carried out on Romanian infrastructure. But as more Bf-109s appeared in the Soviet skies, the TB3 motherships became just too vulnerable. The Zveno project was shelved by January 1942. If you thought a flying tank was absurd, you'll love this. Possibly the craziest 2 vehicles the Soviets, or anyone, ever tried to combine was Ushakov's flying submarine. The inventor, Boris Ushakov, started designing a seaplane and then adding modifications to allow it to submerge. The final design had 3 engines as well as a propeller at the rear. Steel plates kept the engine sealed, while compartments inside the craft were flooded. One of these compartments was the cockpit, so the crew would have to climb into another compartment to pilot the subplane while underwater. The rationale was that the crazy contraption would search for enemy shipping from air, then once it had located a target, fly ahead, land, and submerge until the ship steamed into torpedo range. To facilitate this, the subplane would have to fly around with the periscope, batteries, and torpedoes. The Soviet admirals humoured Ushakov for a time, but they never gave him enough resources to make his invention work. Cool as it may have been to fly around in a submarine, the design just never got off the ground. We've all heard of the Dunkirk evacuation, but did you know the Soviets had a Dunkirk too? While not quite as many as 338,000 soldiers were evacuated from the Estonian port city of Tallinn, the lesser-known Soviet Dunkirk was still of tremendous importance to the Soviet war effort. If the Germans and Finns had obliterated the Baltic fleet here, in the Gulf of Finland, it would have shifted the weight of the entire war. In this video, we're going to shed some light on this desperate operation, as it's in sore need of it. Before they sandwiched poor Poland in September 1939, Germany and the USSR looked to the sovereign states of Europe with hungry eyes. In August, they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which stipulated that Estonia, along with the rest of the Baltic, belonged to the Soviets. When the war kicked off, Estonia didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, declaring itself neutral. Stalin, of course, didn't give a crap. Estonia could give up the goods or suffer the consequences. In mid-1940, some 160,000 Soviet troops marched into the country and the Soviet Baltic fleet set up a blockade. Hardly a shot was fired. The Baltic fleet consumed Estonia's navy. Operating out of the capital of Estonia, the port city Tallinn, the Baltic fleet now had a more westward naval base in the Gulf of Finland. Good stuff, right? Well, not for Estonia. In the first year of Soviet occupation, around 8,000 Estonians were arrested. Over a quarter of them were executed inside of the country. Others went to prison camps, which was as good as a death sentence in itself. Stalin's grip on Estonia wouldn't last forever though. In June 1941, Hitler broke the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by launching Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the USSR. Stalin wept. He wept even harder when he started losing ground to the Germans. After losing Lithuania and Latvia, a large portion of the Baltic fleet concentrated in the port of Tallinn. We're talking between 190 and 225 vessels of various sizes, including the Kirov-class cruiser of the same name. The fleet was under the command of one Admiral Vladimir F. Tributs, while the Red Army ground forces in Estonia were led by the fanatical Marshal Kliment Voroshilov. By early August, Tallinn was well behind the German front lines and the noose was closing. A large-scale land-based withdrawal from Estonia was virtually impossible. The 10th Rifle Corps, which was not even at full strength, and an NKVD division were the only ground-based Soviet units ready to go toe-to-toe with the advancing Germans. To supplement these units, some 10,000 sailors of the Baltic fleet took up arms, becoming naval infantry detachments. It wasn't really what they'd been trained to do, and they suffered because of it. In terms of artillery, the Baltic fleet stepped up and filled that role, with Kirov and the fleet's destroyers laying waste to the Germans from the port. The Soviets had some air support at the start of the fight, but the Germans snatched all of Tallinn's air bases as they closed in. With nowhere to land, the planes had no choice but to fly away from this already grave situation. To make matters worse, the Germans and Finns, now teaming up against the USSR, had been sowing the Gulf of Finland with mines like mines were going out of fashion. Of note, they concentrated some 2,000 mines in the waters of Cape Uminda, to the east of Tallinn. A more aggressive naval operation would have been foolish. Compared with the Baltic fleet, German and Finnish naval forces in the area were pretty minimal. They had some torpedo boats, minesweepers and subs, but nothing bigger than that. By the 25th of August, Admiral Tributs was well and truly feeling the heat and wanted to get the Baltic fleet out of Tallinn. He had no effective means of staving off the damned Luftwaffe, and the German field artillery was now in range of the port. Tributs wanted Voroshilov's permission to pack everyone onto the ships and give it legs, but he also feared the fanatical marshal would think he was being a coward and throttle him dead. Instead, he broke the chain of command, asking for permission directly from the Chief of the Navy. He got it on August the 26th. Now, they just had to figure out how to get more than 200 vessels and some 40,000 people, military and civilian, to safety in the armpit of the Gulf. More specifically, we're referring to the island of Kronstadt off the coast of Leningrad. The Soviets had a lot to contend with, and a lot could and did go wrong. One of the Soviets' earliest mistakes took place in the planning stage. In short, they could sail to Kronstadt along the north shore of the Gulf of Finland, flipping the Finns off on the way, along the south shore, flipping off the Germans in Estonia along the way, or just straight down the middle, flipping off only themselves. There were no mines on the north shore, but they were worried that the Germans would attack them with capital ships, even though they had been informed by the Brits that the Germans did not, in fact, have any capital ships in the Gulf, which was true. The South Shore option was equally a no-go. The Germans might have hit them with their field artillery and captured batteries, and the Estonians crewing the Baltic fleet might have steered their ships toward the coast and tried to defect. Going down the guts of the Gulf was seeming like a pretty solid option, so that's what they did. Only, if you recall, the Germans and Finns had mined the heck out of those waters. Over the next 5 days, 11,000 to 12,400 Soviet and Estonian military personnel and civilians lost their lives. On the ground, many Soviet troops performed rearguard actions to cover the naval evacuation. They set up barricades in the streets and held off desperate civilians and the German advance until they were captured or killed. At least 1,000 people perished at the port, obliterated by Luftwaffe strafes and artillery. It was absolute madness there. Many people were trampled by the crowds, trying in a panic to board the ships. In Admiral Tributs' words, the whole town appeared to be engulfed in flames, burning and exploding. The chaos didn't end once the fleet set sail though. The Soviets had very few minesweepers, and all the other vessels had to stay behind them while they did what they were designed to do. This slowed the convoy to a speed of around 10 knots. They were easy pickings for the Luftwaffe, and the minesweepers could deal with only so many mines. Some ships freaked out and steered out of the minesweepers' wakes only to run straight into the surrounding mines. Some made it through the chaos by pushing the mines away with poles or even jumping into the water and guiding them away by hand. Admiral Tributes recalled the destruction of the destroyer Yakov Sverdlov, a veteran Great War vessel. A column of fire and smoke, 200 to 250 meters high, burst out from under Yakov Sverdlov's body and settled down hissing, burying the surviving crew members. Only several dozens of men were saved. This was just one tragedy among many. Another befell the transport ship Ella, which, carrying over 1,000 passengers, ran into mines and started sinking. The tugboat S-101 attempted a rescue but steered right into another mine and fell to pieces instead. Everyone who had been on the tugboat perished, while just 100 of Ella's passengers were rescued in the end. As with far too many evacuees over that 5-day period, many of them froze to death or drowned. Others were crushed by friendly ships trying to squeeze through the floating wreckage. On at least one occasion, word got around that German and Finnish torpedo boats were in the area. Highly strung, the fleet opened fire on a friendly detachment, thinking they were the so-called torpedo boats. Even when the fleet had made it through the minefields, the Luftwaffe didn't let up. They made the rest of the journey to Kronstadt absolute hell. For example, when the Soviets tried to deposit some evacuees on the island of Gogland, which was about halfway, hoping the Germans would target the boats and not the people, the Luftwaffe strafed the island anyway. It seems they had a strict no-mercy policy that day. In the end, while some 12,400 perished running the so-called gauntlet to Kronstadt, as many as 28,000 survived the ordeal. The Soviets also managed to get 163 to 165 vessels to safety, including the carrier Kirov. If she, and the fleet's other capital ships, hadn't reached the waters off Leningrad, the brutal siege of that city might have been even more brutal. The entire war might have been more brutal. It's a sad fact that a war's worst victims are usually civilians just trying to get on with their lives. In few places has this been more true than Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Caught between two of the most brutal regimes in recent history, Eastern Europeans faced unimaginable hardship. In this video, we shed light on their dark story. As a disclaimer, this is an overview, not an exhaustive list of the atrocities suffered throughout the conflict. Eastern Europe was a very different place in the years preceding the Second World War. For starters, countries such as Poland and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as Soviet-occupied Ukraine and Belarusia, were surprisingly ethnically diverse. A plethora of different languages were spoken throughout the cities and villages. In the south, villages speaking derivatives of Old Mongol and Turkic languages were as common as towns and cities predominantly speaking Yiddish and Polish dialects. The entire regional economy was founded on agriculture. Heavy industry had yet to take over, and most people lived close to the land. It wasn't idyllic, but for the most part, people lived simple lives. But in Soviet-controlled Ukraine and Belarusia, things had already gone bad. State mismanagement and forced collectivization killed between 4 and 5 million Ukrainians during the 1930s. They called the period Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. It was horrific. As described by a contemporary doctor who later starved to death, the good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. As if that wasn't bad enough, the late 1930s brought Stalin's Great Purges to Eastern Europe. No one was safe. Even those in revered authority positions could find themselves on one of Stalin's lists and disappear, never to be seen again. We don't know precisely how many were killed in the purges, but most estimates range from 700,000 to 1.3 million, with thousands of Eastern Europeans included in that number. Things weren't nearly as bad in Poland and the Baltic, areas not under Soviet control, but with the outbreak of war, that soon changed. Once war began and Europe was divided along the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact lines, a second stage in the destruction of Eastern Europe began. The first, from roughly 1933 to 1938, was orchestrated and perpetrated entirely by the Soviet Union, but now Germany had entered the fray. In this second stage, lasting from 1939 to the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Germans and Soviets vied for the bloody honor of who could do more damage to Eastern Europe. Sandwiched between them both, Poland got hit the hardest. Before crossing into Poland, Hitler ordered his top commanders to close your hearts to pity. German soldiers were constantly told that Poles were subhuman barbarians and that they needed to be put in their place by the German Übermensch. They did this by massacring civilians and committing war crimes everywhere they went. The following are just 3 examples. A German armored unit found a barn-turned Polish medical station marked with a red cross. After setting it on fire, the tanks fired on anyone who ran out. Once the building had burned down, the tanks ran over the wounded survivors. Near the village of Sladau, Germans used Polish POWs as human shields while they attacked a cavalry unit. The cavalrymen were wiped out, and the Germans forced the POWs to bury their comrades before executing all 300 of them. In December, 2 German soldiers were killed by a known Polish serial killer. In response, 114 Polish men were rounded up and shot. They had nothing to do with the incident. We probably won't ever know the true scale of the German destruction wrought on Poland during the opening salvos of the war in Europe, but they by no means had a monopoly on war crimes. The Soviets were just as active in the eastern part of the country. Anyone who's looked into the German campaign in the east would have come across Soviet scorched earth policies. In the grand scheme of things, scorched earth makes sense. Trading space for time, forcing your enemy to consume its resources, chasing you deep into the interior. What often goes unmentioned, however, is that ordinary people bear the consequences. As the rapid German advance pushed toward the Russian heartlands, frontline troops began to outrun their supply lines. Their solution was to loot the countryside for the vital food and fuel that they needed. As Ukraine was about to be overrun, Stalin gave the following order: the enemy must not be left a single engine, a single railway car, not a single pound of grain or gallon of fuel. The collective farmers must drive off all of their cattle and turn over their grain to the safekeeping of the state authorities for transportation to the rear. All valuable property that cannot be withdrawn must be destroyed without fail. The NKVD, which managed the Soviet interior, carried out Stalin's orders with gusto, seizing and destroying everything they could get their hands on. Ukraine and Western Russia, the most populous region of the Soviet Union, was scoured. Entire villages were sacked and all food supplies destroyed. Peasants were forced to keep up with the retreating Red Army or face starvation. Even the crown jewels of Soviet industrialization weren't safe. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, one of the Soviet Union's greatest achievements, was blown up by the NKVD troops. They didn't even wait for the Red Army to finish crossing the river first, and the resulting tidal wave killed between 20,000 and 100,000 soldiers and civilians. In the words of journalist H.R. Knickerbocker, the Russians have proved now by their destruction of the Great Dam at Dnipropetrovsk that they mean truly to scorch the earth before Hitler, even if it means the destruction of their most precious possessions. Dniprostroi was an object of almost worship to the Soviet people. It was the largest, most spectacular, and most popular of all the immense projects of the first 5-year plan, and so it occupied a place in the imagination and affection of the Soviet people difficult for us to realize. The soldiers did the fighting, though it was the innocent civilians who suffered for it. But things were about to get a lot worse. Far from liberation, the Red Army's arrival in Eastern Europe heralded yet more suffering for its inhabitants. The Germans adopted scorched earth policies wholesale across Eastern Europe. Anything that peasants managed to keep for themselves was liable to be confiscated by Soviet soldiers who weren't always fed properly. Civilians from Poland and the Baltic states who had been conscripted into the German army or labor corps faced persecution at the hands of their new communist overlords. Even those who had signed the Volkes lists and other documents declaring allegiance to Germany to escape starvation were treated as traitors to the motherland. Thousands were shipped off to Stalin's gulags, their suffering ensured for many more years. Starved and overworked before the war began, plundered and burned by the retreating Red Army in 1941, subjected to genocidal Nazis and the worst of the Holocaust under German occupation, invaded, looted, and scorched a second time by the retreating Germans, then, at the mercy of Stalin's consolidation of power, the civilians of Eastern Europe suffered more during the war than anyone else. There have been few leaders in all human history with more blood on their hands than Joseph Stalin, tyrant of the Soviet Union and architect of the Great Purges. But there was one man, and one man alone, that Stalin couldn't kill. This man was one of the few who had, at times, openly criticized Stalin's policies and was seen by many as the driving force behind the downfall of the Third Reich. His name was Georgy Zhukov, and this is his story. Zhukov's birth and upbringing was perfectly suited to the communist narrative. Born in 1896 to a dirt-poor peasant family in the tiny settlement of Strielkovka, Zhukov's early life was one of hardship. His mother spent her days toiling in the vegetable fields, while his father, a cobbler, spent much time away in Moscow hunting for work. This helped Zhukov Sr. make connections, and in 1908, he was able to secure his son an apprenticeship to a Moscow furrier, a big break for the young peasant lad. 12-year-old Zhukov worked 12 hours a day and frequently suffered beatings from his supervisors, though at the time this was common and seen as necessary for a boy's education. For his actual education, Zhukov went to night school and devoured a wide range of literature. His study buddy, cousin Alex, was studying German in Leipzig to help run the family business. During Alex's many trips back to Moscow, he taught Zhukov basic German, a skill the future marshal would rely on heavily throughout his life. Young Zhukov continued on the path to becoming a furrier until 1915, when a minor event known as World War I abruptly ended his plans. When war broke out, a wave of patriotism swept through Russia. Like many young men of the time, Zhukov was caught up in it. When his uncle suggested Zhukov invalidate himself on medical grounds, the teenager replied, "It is my duty to defend the motherland." As a skilled furrier, Zhukov was assigned to the cavalry, something he was very proud of. His intelligence singled him out, and his commander sent him away to be trained as an NCO. In August 1916, he got his first taste of combat. Fighting on the Moldovan front, Zhukov captured a German officer and interrogated him in German, acquiring some valuable intel. He was awarded the St. George Cross for this, the first of many, many decorations Zhukov would be awarded throughout his career. A man who led by example and preferred encouraging soldiers to beating them, Zhukov was his regiment's most popular NCO. When the Tsar fell in 1917 and the army politicized, Zhukov was thrust into a position of significant authority as a regimental Soviet delegate. Seeing the writing on the wall, Zhukov left the Imperial Army and joined the Red Army in 1918. His popularity, leadership, and bravery on the battlefield furnished him with rapid promotions. Bolshevik officials desperately needed reliable leaders, and Zhukov's career was accelerated. But it wasn't all handshaking and swift promotions. Time and again, Zhukov was sent into combat against White Russian factions on Russia's vast steppes. These battles were bloody and were often decided by brutal melee combat between saber-wielding horsemen. Zhukov recalled, "In a hand-to-hand fight, a White Russian fired his sawed-off rifle at me and killed my horse. We fell, the horse pinning me down. The next moment I would have been slashed to death but for Novchevka, the commissar. With a swing of his saber, he killed the horseman, caught the reins of his horse, and pulled me into the saddle. During the 1930s, Zhukov rose quickly in the Red Army High Command. An old unit of his, the 1st Cavalry Division, was largely spared from Stalin's Great Purges due to its well-connected political officers. Combined with his reputation, many accolades, and party membership, Zhukov managed to avoid death by firing squad and keep his job. But he remained fearful. His daughters Ira and Ella later recalled that their father kept a grab bag ready to go at all times, just in case he needed to make a quick getaway from the NKVD. In his memoirs, Zhukov described the Great Purges as the most difficult emotional experience in his life. The order to report to Mongolia, far from Stalin's clutches, couldn't have come at a better time. Zhukov, now a corps commander, took command of the 1st Soviet Mongolian Army Group in 1938. The Mongolians had been fighting bitterly against the encroaching Japanese for years, but no decisive battle had taken place. Zhukov would change that. He would strike a blow so devastating that Japanese ambitions in Siberia would be crushed forever. It happened at Khalkhin Gol. On one side of the Khalkha River stood 30,000 Japanese soldiers of the Kwantung Army and their allies, along with 92 tanks and 200 planes. Across from them were 63,000 Red Army soldiers and Mongolian cavalrymen, 900 armored vehicles, and 580 warplanes. Feigning a Great War-style heavy bombardment and frontal assault, Zhukov maneuvered his tanks on the Japanese flanks. While the Japanese infantry focused on their enemy to their front, they were encircled by Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks. The plan was as daring as it was successful, and Zhukov crushed the entire Japanese 6th Army. The battle gave him crucial experience in encirclement operations, something that would later prove vital in the campaign to liberate the Soviet Union from the Axis. The string of defeats suffered by the Red Army at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa were greater than any suffered by any army throughout all of human history. And who was in charge of the Red Army at that time? Zhukov. But instead of having him killed, which is what you'd probably expect from Stalin, the victor of Khalkhin Gol was sent to Smolensk with an important mission: pin the Wehrmacht down and protect Moscow. Fighting offensively instead of defensively, Zhukov pulled his old encirclement trick on the Germans north of Moscow. Unfortunately, with the Red Army in the state it was, the offensive failed. But the Germans were halted for some months, and their drive toward Moscow was jeopardized. From then on, Zhukov's commands read like a laundry list from the most important battles of the Eastern Front. The Battle of Moscow, the Battle of Rzhev, the defense of Stalingrad, the Kalinin Front, Operation Mars, and many others. His fellow general, Konstantin Rokossovsky, described Zhukov like this: has a strong will, decisive and firm, often demonstrates initiative and skillfully applies it, disciplined, demanding and persistent in his demands, a somewhat ungracious and not sufficiently sympathetic person, rather stubborn, painfully proud, in professional terms well-trained, broadly experienced as a military leader. Absolutely cannot be used in staff or teaching jobs because constitutionally he hates them. But this somewhat ungracious and not sufficiently sympathetic person was great at winning wars, and that was exactly what he was about to do. Na Zepad. In Russian, it means to the west. These words summarized Zhukov's campaigns from mid-1943 onwards. After the decisive defeat of the Wehrmacht's operational citadel and the total reversal during the Battle of Kursk, the Axis were on the run. Heinz Guderian, the chief of the German General Staff, said after Kursk, there were to be no more periods of quiet on the Eastern Front. From now on, the enemy was in undisputed possession of the initiative. Zhukov pressed his victory for all its advantages. He told his soldiers, "Remember our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, our wives and children tortured to death by the Germans. We shall exact a brutal revenge for everything." That's exactly what he did. All the way to Berlin, where he personally accepted the German instrument of surrender. To the Soviet people, Zhukov was the world's greatest hero. They believed he had single-handedly forced the Axis from their land and beat Hitler and his subordinates into submission. But for Stalin, this was a problem. A man more popular than him was a man to be feared. Zhukov commanded more than just respect from the military. He commanded its absolute loyalty. Whether in command or not, Zhukov could walk into any headquarters and the men of the Red Army would follow him no matter what. This worried the chief of the NKVD, Beria, who on several occasions attempted to implicate Zhukov in plots to get him locked up. Bad idea. When Stalin died in 1953, his underlings scrambled to seize power. They made shady deals with each other and formed coalitions, but Zhukov was the real kingmaker. Whoever he backed had the backing of the mighty Red Army. When Beria tried to position himself as the next Stalin, Zhukov facilitated his death. He may have begun life as a lowly peasant, but now he was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Few fates were more horrifying than imprisonment in a Soviet gulag. Sent to labor camps in the farthest reaches of civilization, gulag prisoners provided the slave labor that fueled the USSR's rapid industrial growth. In this video, we tell the stories of 4 of the worst gulag camps in the Soviet Union. Once Joseph Stalin, one of history's most brutal tyrants, seized power over the fledgling Soviet Union, prisons rapidly filled up. Stalin's paranoia regarding so-called counter-revolutionaries knew no bounds, and decades-long sentences were handed out for the most minor infractions. But there was a method in this madness. Stalin and his henchmen needed a workforce to extract raw materials and start building the immense construction projects detailed in their 5-year plan. Camps were either centered around the extraction of a specific raw material, such as lumber, minerals, or fuel, or served to house construction workers while they worked on a major project. Many small and large camps were run by regional administrators, and they, in turn, reported to the Central Committee. This committee set production quotas and was known as Gulag, while the regional administrators were named after settlements. Centralized management often meant those setting production quotas were severely out of touch with camp conditions. It didn't matter if the coal miners at Vorkuta were already working 16 hours a day. If the Central Committee demanded more coal, they would get more coal. This committee also had an approved mortality rate for prisoners. If mortality fell below that rate, inspectors would be sent to the camp to determine if the guards were going too easy on the prisoners. If mortality rates rose too high, they just sent more prisoners. As long as quotas were being filled, they didn't care what went on. With management like this, camp administrators had free rein to exploit their prisoners for all they were worth. From 1925, the prisoner barracks at Solovetsky Special Prison Camp began filling with political prisoners, ex-White Army officers, Kronstadt sailors, and aristocrats from the Tsar's regime. The camp was spread over several islands in the ice-blocked White Sea just below the Arctic Circle. Here, prisoners worked as slave laborers, chopping wood without breaks, all day, every day. Life was almost unbearable for Solovetsky's 6,000-odd prisoners. In a small camp on the island of Anza, a group of prisoners chopped off each other's hands and feet just to get a chance at a few days' rest in hospital. Camp administrator Potapov found this amusing and, after shooting the offending prisoners, kept their severed body parts in a pile outside his office. He called them his pearls and showed them to visiting secret police officers and new prisoners. Even the environment of the camps slowly sapped the prisoners of their strength. The writer and political prisoner Oleg Volkov described laying on his bed, which was just a wooden board, and having bedbugs fall onto him, one after another, like ants. Not able to sleep, Volkov went outside where he was enveloped by clouds of mosquitoes. He later wrote, "I gazed with envy at those who slept soundly, covered in parasites." Klinger, a White Army officer, described the punishment where a guard would strip a prisoner then leave them tied to a post near a pond in the woods. Within a day, the prisoner would be unconscious from pain and blood loss, fed on continuously by thousands of mosquitoes. Far from the White Sea, in the Russian Far East, was another labor camp from hell. The Kolyma region's camps, centered around the settlement of Magadan, became synonymous in the Soviet Union with an exhausting, agonizing death. To reach Kolyma from the prisons in Russia's west, prisoners first had to take a train across the whole of Siberia. They were packed into cattle cars which were stifling in the summer and frigid in the winter. Elderly and physically weak people often died while crammed into these trains, and their bodies were sometimes left alongside the living prisoners for hours. Once the train made one of its periodic stops, guards would check each other for corpses and toss them into the wilderness to be eaten by scavengers. After debarking the train, prisoners were herded onto ships to take them to Magadan, a small city built entirely on slave labor. Conditions were no better on the ships, and this voyage usually claimed more lives. In Magadan's first year, only 9,928 of the initial 16,000 prisoners made it to the camp alive. Even though they were technically on the mainland, camp residents saw themselves as part of an island chain or archipelago. The famous dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, coined the term Gulag Archipelago when describing his time around Magadan. In his account detailing the horrors of camps, he quotes camp commandant Naftali Frenkel. Frenkel, one of the masterminds behind the Solovetsky camp, stated, "We have to squeeze everything out of a prisoner in the first 3 months. After that, we don't need him anymore." After those 3 months, these prisoners were called goners. Drained of energy, motivation, and hope, these men and women weren't expected to survive much longer. Tragically, deliberate policies of starvation and overwork weren't limited to the Kolyma camps in the Far East. They were common through the Arctic and subarctic camps of northern Russia. One of the most infamous of these is the Vorkutlag, the camp next to the city of Vorkuta. Vorkuta was established in 1932 as a mining base to extract coal from the immense Pechora coal basin. Unfortunately for the prisoners, it was located 160 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where conditions were atrocious. Aside from back-breaking forced labor in the mine shafts, the prisoners had gangs to contend with. The Gulag administrators used Vorkutlag as a dumping ground, sending away their most hardened professional criminals to toil in the Arctic coal mines. These men were thrown in with Wehrmacht POWs and political prisoners whose only crime might have been their ethnicity. In Vorkutlag, as in many of the other camps, the guards and professional criminals joined forces to keep the 70,000 prisoners in line. Mafia enforcers and organized crime bosses received extra supplies from the guards in return for their cooperation. This system fell apart in 1953 when forced laborers threw down their tools and refused to work. The strike spread to other camps and eventually 15,000 prisoners rose up in rebellion against the guards. Camp Commandant Derevyanko put down the strike in brutal Soviet style by ordering his soldiers to shoot at the prisoners until they went back to work. Estimates vary, but it's likely that at least 53 were killed by the trigger-happy guards. Another of the infamous Kolyma camps was Sevostlag. Centered around rich gold and tin mines, prisoners in Sevostlag spent most of their time underground, tunneling their way into the bedrock of the Russian Far East. Sevostlag was technically not part of the Gulag system, as it was run by a committee set up to develop the Soviet Union's eastern fringes. But like many of the great projects of the Soviet Union, the foundations were laid by people forced to endure the worst conditions imaginable. The slave miners locked in Sevostlag mined gold so Stalin could buy materials from Europe. They were the lucky ones. The unlucky prisoners worked on the Kolyma Highway, now Russian Federal Highway R504. But this highway has another name, the Road of Bones. The Road of Bones is built over permafrost, meaning digging is extremely difficult. The Sevostlag prisoners who were forced to build it weren't provided with tools beyond shovels and picks, but they had construction quotas to meet, so the guards kept them working around the clock. Prisoners slept out in the snow and ate nothing but thin soup while working on the construction. Under these conditions, the death rate soared. Between 250,000 and 1 million people are estimated to have died during the construction of the Kolyma Highway. With the earth too frozen to bury their bodies, the dead were interred in the road. If you drive the length of the road, know that the whole thing, all 2,000 kilometers of it, was laid, quite literally, on a foundation of corpses. Those were 4 of the worst Gulag camps the Soviet Union ever constructed. One of the most remarkable things about studying war history is learning about groups of people whose bravery was largely swept under the rug. And no group's contribution to the war effort was more underappreciated than the Arctic Convoys, who saved the USSR's ass in World War II. For 4 years, 78 convoys traveled through the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans to deliver supplies to the Soviets. Without these supplies, the USSR would almost certainly have fallen to Germany. In this video, we're going to look at why that is and how a bunch of frozen Allied soldiers saved a nation. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, invading the USSR with 4.3 million German and Axis soldiers and 4,000 tanks. This was the largest land army ever assembled in human history. The invasion all but forced the Soviets to ally with the Western Allies. Though Churchill wasn't a fan of Stalin and his Bolshevik politics, he was eager for another ally in the war. Nor was Stalin, backed into a corner by the Germans, in a position to turn down a friend. They signed the Anglo-Soviet agreement on the 12th of July, agreeing to combine their efforts to take down Hitler. Churchill immediately dispatched 40 Hawker Hurricanes and 500 pilots and mechanics to defend the Soviet port of Archangel. But this was just the start. All in all, Britain and the US sent 3,000 Hurricanes and 4,000 other aircraft in support of the Soviets, along with other supplies and military equipment, including tanks and even food, to the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. Getting these supplies to the USSR was the tricky part. The British sent its first convoy, the Dervish, from Scapa Flow on August 17, 1941. The convoy sailed for Iceland before swinging around and heading to the Soviet Union, where, surrounded by polar ice, it arrived in Archangel on August 31. The Germans weren't aware of the convoy until Churchill announced its success in the House of Commons days later. Hitler was furious that the British had gotten the better of him and ordered German naval units to Norway to deter future convoys. Despite this early success, the Soviets weren't getting what they needed to keep the Germans at bay. So in October 1941, they signed the Lend-Lease agreement with the Americans, securing additional war materials. These were greatly needed, as much of the equipment the Soviets brought to bear was near obsolete in comparison to German equipment. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa alone, the Soviets lost 15,000, amounting to half of their fleet of tanks, which were no match for the German panzers. To ensure the Soviets were well supplied, the Allies formed 3 principal shipping routes to the USSR. First, there was the Persian Corridor, which ran from the Persian Gulf and across Persia to the Caspian Sea, where it connected with the Soviet rail network. Then there was the route that ran from the US and Canadian West Coast ports across the North Pacific to Vladivostok. The Soviet-Japanese neutrality agreement complicated this route, as it stated that Soviet ships could only transport non-military supplies. But they put the Lend-Lease supplies on Soviet cargo ships anyway and hoped for the best. Luckily for the Allies, the Japanese military honored the agreement and never attacked any Soviet freighters in the Pacific. And finally, there was the Arctic route, which ran from Icelandic and British ports and along the northern coasts of Nordic countries into Archangel and Murmansk. However, the route had a German presence as they tried to take down Allied transports, which made things a lot harder for the convoys. Between August 1941 and May 1945, a total of 78 convoys took the Arctic route. Of all the routes to the Soviet Union, this one was by far the most unforgiving. The constant threat of German attack aside, the crews of these ships also had to contend with harsh weather, including dense fog, drift ice, and strong currents. In the winter, they had to navigate in perpetual darkness, and in summer, they were susceptible to German attacks under the midnight sun. The seamen in these convoys had to wear special suits when working on deck to protect them from the extreme temperatures. In reality, the suits were impractical and hardly ever worn. If a ship got torpedoed, there wouldn't have been enough time to put one on. Without a suit, life expectancy in the frigid waters in the Arctic winter was less than 2 minutes, and it was only slightly better in the summertime. The convoys were largely put together in Hafalja, Iceland, and Loch Ewe in Scotland. Most Icelandic convoys had the designation PQ on their outbound voyages and QP on their return voyages, whereas British convoys had the designation JW on their outbound journeys and RA on the returns, though there were some PQ convoys sailing from Britain too. This made it easier for the US and Canadian navies to identify them when running support convoys. Starting in 1943, the Americans and Canadians deployed escort carriers to defend the convoys against German air attacks. This was essential as the Arctic convoys were carrying incredibly important supplies, including fighter planes, tanks, ammunition, fuel, raw materials, and food. During the 2-year siege of Leningrad, the convoys were one of the city's few and most critical lifelines. In total, around 1,400 trips were carried out by around 400 cargo ships, of which the Germans sunk 85. In addition, 16 Royal Navy ships, which included 8 corvettes, 6 destroyers, and 2 cruisers, were put below the waves. One convoy, PQ-17, experienced the greatest loss of any convoy during the war, losing 24 of its 35 ships between Spitsbergen and Novaya Zemlya. The Germans lost far fewer vessels. We're talking about 1 battlecruiser, 1 battleship, 3 destroyers, and 30 U-boats. Although the loss of the battlecruiser and battleship was pretty big for the Germans. The most significant naval battle involving the Arctic convoys was the Battle of Barents Sea, fought between the Kriegsmarine and Royal Navy. On December 31st, 1942, the Germans tried to intercept a 14-ship convoy sailing from Murmansk. The ships were carrying 33 bombers, 87 fighters, 202 tanks, 2,046 other vehicles, and 80 tons of supplies, including 25 tons of fuel. Escorting the convoy were 6 Royal Navy destroyers and a number of corvettes. Additionally, the Royal Navy had stationed 2 destroyers and 2 cruisers in the Barents Sea. On the German side, the Kriegsmarine force deployed 6 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers. While both sides brought to bear the same number of ships, the German fleet boasted superior firepower as it was hell-bent on sinking the entire convoy. While the Royal Navy was outgunned, it was not outwitted. Commander of the British fleet, Robert Sherbrooke, knew their only real defense against the Germans was their torpedoes. Not wanting to play his best card first, he maneuvered his ship so it looked like it was preparing to launch a torpedo, and the Germans fell for the bluff, withdrawing one of their heavy cruisers before the battle even started. But that cruiser bluffed as well and swung around to the north side of the convoy, where it fired on minesweepers and destroyers, sinking 1 of each. Following this, chaos ensued for about 4 hours. Because the battle took place in the middle of the polar night, it was extremely difficult to tell the difference between friendly and hostile ships. And the smoke from damaged and sinking ships only added to the confusion as both sides continued to fire without always knowing whom they were firing on. As a result of all this confusion, the short battle ended when the Germans decided the risk of sinking their own ships and killing their own men was too high, and they retreated. In the end, each side managed to sink a destroyer. The Brits also damaged a German heavy cruiser and the Germans a British destroyer. The British lost a total of 250 men and the Germans 330. The surviving Germans retreated to a base in Norway, and the convoy made it to its destination without losing any cargo. Throughout the years the convoys went through the Arctic, they saw relatively few battles. And of the ones they did see, most were short-lived, like the Battle of Barents Sea we just talked about. Overall, the operation in the Arctic was a major success, with relatively low losses over the 4 years it was active. This was largely due to the breaking of the Enigma code, which allowed British intelligence to relay German U-boat positions to the convoys. Even though the Arctic convoys are considered a minor part of World War II, the convoys sustained the Soviets in their fight against the Germans. They also proved to the Soviets that the Western Allies were committed to their alliance. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the largest invasion in history, many Soviet women volunteered to defend their homeland. They were initially turned away, but as Soviet casualties piled up, Stalin decided to accept women into the Red Army simply because he needed all the soldiers he could get. Some 800,000 women served in the Red Army throughout the war. 200,000 of those women became decorated soldiers, and 89 were awarded the highest honor the USSR granted, the Hero of the Soviet Union. Some of the women to receive this award were snipers and some of the most successful in the entire war. One was even deemed the 5th deadliest sniper in history. In this video, we're going to shed some light on the incredibly badass female snipers of the Soviet Union. The Red Army deployed over 2,000 female snipers during a 4-year period. Only 500 or so survived the war, but some live on forever in the history books. To put it in perspective, the Red Army's female snipers racked up a combined kill count of approximately 11,000. The Central Women's School of Sniper Training was founded in March 1942 and recruited women between the ages of 18 and 26 who were physically fit and had at least 7 years of education. The majority of female Soviet snipers were trained at this school. The Soviets believed women would make good snipers because they could withstand cold and stress better than their male counterparts. They also believed that women were more patient, which meant they would wait to land that perfect shot. After graduating from the school, these snipers were assigned to different units and sent to some of the most dangerous battlegrounds in the Soviet Union. Many of them displayed excellence, but here are 4 of the most celebrated snipers. Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polivanova were best friends and talented snipers. Born in 1920 and 1922 respectively, the pair met as students at a research institute in Moscow. After the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Kovshova, the older and more battle-ready of the two, joined the People's Militia, an unofficial military group. Once women were allowed to enlist in the Red Army, she began training as a sniper with the 528th Rifle Regiment, with Polivanova joining her shortly after. In January 1942, the pair completed training and were assigned to the same unit, the 528th Rifle Regiment, where they both earned the respect of their commanders for their skills. They were the resident sniper duo of the regiment, with Kovshova serving as the shooter and Polivanova the spotter. Kovshova's skill as a sharpshooter earned her the job of teaching new soldiers how to use rifles. The best of her students she took aside, teaching them how to be snipers. Kovshova and Polivanova were sent on a number of missions on the northwestern front, but their last and most famous one came in August 1942, when they were sent to Sutoki Biavoko in the Novgorod Oblast to drive Germans out of a village. Unfortunately for the Soviets, luck was on the German side on this day of the battle, and the Soviet casualties quickly piled up. When the commander of the unit was killed, Kovshova took over and gave the order to open fire. When the Germans realized they were being attacked by snipers, they answered with a shower of mortar fire. The situation was truly hopeless for the Soviets, so much so that one soldier asked Kovshova if they could retreat, to which she replied, "Not one step back," Stalin's slogan at the time. In the end, only Kovshova and Polivanova were still breathing. Injured, out of ammo, and surrounded by Germans, they made their last stand. They each pulled a pin from a grenade, reportedly kissed, and blew themselves up along with some surrounding Germans. They were posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union the following year. In June 1942, 18-year-old kindergarten teacher Rosa Shanina joined the Red Army as a sniper after her brother was slain in Leningrad. She enrolled in the Central Women's Sniper Training School, from which she graduated with honors in 1944. She was praised for her ability to shoot doublets, which is when you hit 2 targets with 2 rounds in very quick succession. Her instructors asked if she would stay on and teach, but she refused, instead answering the call of duty. That call eventually landed her in the 184th Rifle Division, which had a separate female sniper platoon. Due to her talent as a sharpshooter, Shanina was appointed as one of the platoon's commanders as soon as she arrived. On the 5th of April 1944, just 3 days after she'd joined the platoon, Shanina iced her first German soldier. According to an anonymous author, after she fired the fatal shot, she slid down into her trench in disbelief and said, "I've killed a man." Clearly, it didn't take Shanina very long to come to terms with her actions, because between the 6th and 11th of that same month, she dropped a further 13 enemy soldiers while subjected to heavy artillery fire during the battle for the village of Kozygori. Her bravery in this battle earned her first military decoration, the Order of Glory, 3rd class. In June of the same year, as the Soviet Union was launching its offensive Operation Bagration, the decision was made to pull all female snipers from the front lines. This was because it was Soviet policy to spare snipers. They didn't want to lose all of their sharpshooters in one operation. Shanina was not happy about being removed from the action and requested to be sent to the front lines anyway, going so far as to write to Stalin directly twice. Despite her efforts, she was refused. Pissed off, she decided to go anyway. This earned her a sanction, but she was never court-martialed, so she carried on fighting. During Operation Bagration, she was part of a group tasked with eliminating encircled German soldiers. During one sub-operation, her efforts contributed to the recapture of Vitebsk. Come July, Shanina was again joined by her sisters-in-arms en route to Vilnius to drive out the Germans. In that battle alone, she racked up 12 confirmed kills. By the end of August, just 5 months after she'd come out of training, Shanina's confirmed kill count reached 42. That month, she was serving under the 1st Soviet Division to enter East Prussia. In a single day of war, she managed to kill 5 enemy soldiers on their own soil from the safety of a sniper's nest, much to the amazement of some Canadian journalists who branded her the unseen terror of East Prussia. In October, Shanina became one of the first female snipers to receive the Medal of Courage, but unfortunately, Shanina didn't live long into the following year. In January 1945, while stationed in East Prussia, Shanina knew the end was approaching. With 72 of 78 soldiers in her battalion killed, she wrote in her diary about how she may also soon be dead. In her last ever diary entry, she wrote about how she and her remaining comrades were hiding out in tanks after the German fire became too intense. The day after this entry, a shell fragment tore open her chest. She was taken to a Soviet hospital, but there was nothing they could do. One nurse recalled Shanina saying that her only regret was that she had done so little. She passed away soon after. In total, after less than a year of fighting, her confirmed kill count was 59. Her diary was published in 1965, solidifying her place in Soviet history and reviving the Soviet people's appreciation for her incredible bravery and skill. Known also as Lady Death, Ludmila Pavlichenko remains the most successful female sniper in history and the 5th most successful overall. Born just outside of what is now Kiev, Ukraine in 1960, Pavlichenko was a self-described competitive tomboy who took up shooting long before World War II, earning a certificate for marksmanship as a teenager. At just 16, she married and gave birth to her first and only child. Her marriage soon crumbled, however, and she moved back in with her parents. During that time, she got a job as a grinder at the Kiev Arsenal factory. In 1937, Pavlichenko enrolled at Kiev University, where she studied history in the hopes of becoming a teacher. During her final year of studies, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and Pavlichenko didn't hesitate to drop everything and join the fight. In fact, she was one of the first people to volunteer at the Odessa recruiting office. While she specifically requested to serve in the infantry, the registrar pushed her to serve as a nurse. Pavlichenko said absolutely not, and once the registrar saw she had experience as a markswoman, she was permitted to join the Red Army as a sniper, assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. As one of the first women in the Red Army, her male comrades didn't accept her immediately. That changed on the 8th of August 1941, however, when she smoked 2 enemy soldiers with a rifle handed to her by a fallen comrade. For the following 2.5 months, Pavlichenko fought in the siege of Odessa and racked up a ridiculous 187 confirmed kills. After her 100th kill, she was promoted to the rank of senior sergeant. In October 1941, Pavlichenko and her unit were sent to Crimea, where they fought in the siege of Sevastopol. During this time, she was tasked with training fresh snipers who collectively killed 100 enemy soldiers. By May 1942, Pavlichenko was promoted to lieutenant, at which point she had 257 confirmed kills under her belt. In June 1942, she took mortar shrapnel to the face, an injury which ended her sharpshooting career. Her final kill count was 309. This figure includes 36 enemy snipers. Pavlichenko spent the rest of the war working as a propagandist for the Red Army and training new snipers. As part of her work as a propagandist, Pavlichenko was sent on a tour of Great Britain, Canada, and the United States in 1942. Her task was to rally support from the Western Allies and encourage them to open a second front against the Germans. FDR welcomed Pavlichenko at the White House, making her the first Soviet citizen to be received by a US president. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt also took Pavlichenko on a tour of the US, during which time the press didn't take her all that seriously. She was referred to as the girl sniper, and the male reporters made comments about her uniform, saying that the skirt was too long and made her look fat. They also asked her stupid questions, like if she wore makeup on the front lines. Eventually, Pavlichenko became fed up and told the press, "Gentlemen, I'm 25 years old and I've killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think you've been hiding behind my back for too long?" Konstantin Rokossovsky was one of the highest-ranking military officers in the Soviet Union and Poland during World War II and beyond. Born in Warsaw in what was then the Russian Empire, Rokossovsky dedicated much of his life to defending his homeland. But things did not always go smoothly for Rokossovsky in his military career. As a victim of Stalin's Great Purge, he suffered a great deal. But despite the hardship he faced at the hands of the government, he remained loyal to the Red Army. In this video, we're going to take a look at Rokossovsky's life and try to understand why he stayed loyal to the government that tortured him. Rokossovsky enlisted in the Russian army in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. He was placed in the Kargopolsky 5th Dragoon Regiment, where he started as a non-commissioned officer. Throughout the war, he proved himself to be a skilled soldier and brave leader, which landed him a spot in the cavalry. He was also injured twice, which led him to receiving the Cross of St. George, a military decoration awarded by Imperial Russia to soldiers in the lower ranks who showed great courage. In 1917, Rokossovsky joined the Bolshevik Party and then the Red Army shortly after. When the Russian Civil War started, he was given command of a cavalry brigade. He and his men fought their enemy, the White Russians, in the Ural Mountains. It was during this campaign that Rokossovsky received the Order of the Red Banner, the highest military decoration any Soviet could receive at the time. He earned it after he killed the opposing officer who had injured him previously. In 1921, Rokossovsky and his cavalry played a major role in helping Mongolian forces capture their own capital city of Ulaanbaatar after it had fallen to Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, a White Russian general who thought he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Rokossovsky spent 1924 and 1925 in the Leningrad Higher Cavalry School, where he first met Georgy Zhukov, a man with whom he would later have a fierce rivalry during the Second World War. After finishing school, he returned to Mongolia, where he trained Mongolian soldiers and participated in a few other armed conflicts. He continued to work his way up the ranks until he reached senior command, but that position didn't last forever. Rokossovsky fell victim to Stalin's Great Purge in 1938. This event was the culmination of Stalin's paranoia and desire for power. It was his campaign to eliminate anyone he deemed even a little bit of a threat. The majority of the victims of this purge were in politics and the military, but it eventually trickled down to include everyday professionals, academics, and even peasants. It's difficult to know for sure how many people were executed in the Great Purge, but most experts agree on a figure of around 750,000, while an additional 1 million people were sent to forced labor camps, maybe more. Stalin's government accused Rokossovsky of being a spy. The reason behind this is unclear, but historians believe that Rokossovsky's use of Mikhail Tukhachevsky's military methods may have had something to do with it. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was a military officer and theoretician who worked to modernize the Soviet Union's military throughout the 1920s and 30s. He developed the theory of deep operation, which was the tactic of striking deep behind enemy lines to take them by surprise and destroy much of their formations and supply lines. The established Soviet military of the time resisted these new ideas, but by the mid-1930s, much of the Red Army had adopted Tukhachevsky's tactics. But merely because these ideas were new, Stalin saw them as a threat. He arrested Tukhachevsky for treason, tortured him, tried him, and ultimately executed the poor man. Once in custody, Rokossovsky was accused of having links to Japanese and Polish intelligence. Allegedly, Rokossovsky met with Colonel Komatsubara, head of a Japanese military mission in Harbin, China in 1932. Instead of denying the meeting ever took place, Rokossovsky tried to justify it by saying it was necessary because they were deciding what they would do with some captured Chinese. This was as good as an admission of guilt to the men who arrested him. Rokossovsky's own negligence as a commander further supported the accusation. Things like not training his men, not keeping his camp neat and tidy, and sending his men out into the cold, despite knowing it would increase the number of dead horses and sick soldiers. These acts were interpreted as deliberate acts of sabotage against the Soviet Union. Rokossovsky endured non-stop torture during his time in prison. His fingers were broken, the nails were removed, his ribs were cracked, and on 2 different occasions, he was brought outside for a fake shooting ceremony just to F with his head. Despite all of this, Rokossovsky didn't blame Stalin for his suffering. He only blamed the police, even though they were acting on Stalin's orders. Rokossovsky continued to proclaim his innocence and refused to sign the false confession statement the police had written for him. One of Rokossovsky's cellmates later wrote about this in a memoir, saying, "Those who refused to sign a false statement were beaten up as long as the false statement was not signed. There were steadfast people who stubbornly did not sign, but there were relatively few. K.K. Rokossovsky, as he sat with me in the same cell, did not sign a false statement, but he was a brave and strong man, tall and broad-shouldered. He too was beaten." Rokossovsky's refusal to sign the confession was part of the reason he was found not guilty of treason at his trial. He said he would sign it if the court was able to bring Adolf Yushkevich, who had been one of his colleagues in the Civil War. Yushkevich had given a testimony denouncing Rokossovsky years before, which was being used as evidence against him in the trial. However, Yushkevich had been killed back in 1920 and thus couldn't come to court. When the court learned that Yushkevich had long been dead, it couldn't justify sending Rokossovsky to the gallows. Rokossovsky was then sent to a prison in Leningrad, where he remained until March 1940, when he was released suddenly and without explanation. Rokossovsky rejoined the Red Army after his release. His former commander, Simon Timoshenko, was in desperate need of experienced military officers in the rapidly growing Soviet military. Rokossovsky was commissioned as a colonel in command of the 5th Cavalry Corps and was soon after promoted to Major General. Rokossovsky served throughout World War II, and we're not exaggerating when we say that he absolutely smashed it during the war. We don't have time to go over all of Rokossovsky's achievements, but here's some of the highlights. In September 1941, Rokossovsky was personally appointed by Stalin to command the 16th Army. He was sent to defend Moscow as the Germans approached. During the Battle of Moscow, Rokossovsky was under the direct command of his rival Zhukov. The two worked together during the battle as well as they could, but their opposing styles of military leadership caused tension. That all came to a head when, in November 1941, after Rokossovsky and his men had staved off the German advance, they were backed into a corner by the 4th Panzer Group in the Germans' Hail Mary attempt to encircle the capital. Rokossovsky asked Zhukov if he and his men could retreat and find a more advantageous position, but Zhukov refused, ordering Rokossovsky to hold. Displeased, Rokossovsky went over Zhukov's head and asked the next highest ranking officer for permission to retreat, which was granted. This infuriated Zhukov, who threw out the order to retreat and forced Rokossovsky and his men to hold their position. This move led to the Panzer Group breaking through the Soviet lines and winning a strategic position north of Moscow. If Zhukov had allowed Rokossovsky and his men to retreat, the Germans would not have advanced as much as they did. While being right over your rival is an achievement on its own, that was nothing compared to Rokossovsky's greatest success of the war, which occurred in January 1943. Stalin had sent Rokossovsky to Stalingrad in October to stamp out the surviving German forces littering the city. He was granted around 218,000 soldiers, 6,500 guns, 2,500 tanks, and 300 aircraft to complete his mission. On January 10th, after much planning, he launched what became known as Operation Ring. Though Rokossovsky and his men were better armed, the Germans fought ferociously, and in the first 3 days, Rokossovsky lost 26,000 men and half of his tanks. When Rokossovsky relaunched the offensive after regrouping, he struck harder and captured the Germans' last remaining airfields before driving them into the heart of the city. At that point, the commander of the Germans, General Paulus, asked Hitler if he could surrender, but the Führer said no. Rokossovsky split the Germans into 2 pockets and slowly wore them down over a few days. Soon, they had no choice but to surrender. In total, Rokossovsky either destroyed or captured 22 German divisions and ended the crescendo of the German advance into the USSR. For this, Rokossovsky was promoted to the rank of Colonel General. Following his success in Stalingrad, Rokossovsky wrote this in his diary: "I'm appointed commander of the Central Front. It means that Stalin has entrusted me to play the key part in the Summer Kursk campaign." The Kursk campaign was a massive attack on the Germans positioned near Kursk. But the Germans were also planning an offensive, and when the Soviets caught wind of it, they hunkered down and went on the defensive instead. The German offensive began in June 1943, and Rokossovsky narrowly escaped death after his HQ was bombed in a night raid. After that, Rokossovsky's HQ was moved underground. From there, Rokossovsky served as commander of one of the largest tank battles of the Second World War. Known as Operation Citadel to the Germans, it involved more than 8,000 tanks and 2.6 million men in total. As the Germans rolled in, Rokossovsky organized the Soviet defense, which held strong. He eventually ordered his troops to counterattack, however, which resulted in heavy losses. Realizing his mistake, he again switched up his strategy, going back on the defensive and leaving the Germans to enjoy the Soviet minefields. By the end of the battle, around 2,000 tanks had been destroyed and more than 200,000 men had been killed. The Germans, unable to penetrate the Soviet defense, were ordered to retreat, spelling out yet another victory for Rokossovsky. At the end of the war, Rokossovsky held the highest military rank possible, Marshal of the Soviet Union. He was one of the most prominent Soviet commanders of the war and participated in the victory parade in Moscow. Rokossovsky remained loyal to the Soviet Union for the rest of his life, appointed by Stalin as the commander of the Soviet forces in Poland and then Poland's first minister of national defense. During his time in politics, he worked to Stalinize Poland and actively fought the Polish independence movement. He introduced the practice of sending able-bodied men to labor camps if they were deemed anti-Soviet. In 1956, he also approved an order to use the military to break up protests which stood against working conditions under the Soviet Union and Soviet rule in general. Rokossovsky sent 10,000 men and 360 tanks to stamp out these protests, and 74 civilians were killed as a result. Rokossovsky stayed incredibly loyal to the Soviet Union until he succumbed to prostate cancer in 1968. What blows our minds was his loyalty to a regime that had tortured him and wanted him dead. Ask someone what the Komitet Gosodazvenyoy Bezopasnostia is, and unless they're a Russian speaker, you're likely to be met with a blank look. Trim this cumbersome phrase down to its 3-letter acronym, however, and you'll probably get a response. Most people are aware of the KGB, at least to some extent. They probably know that this was a shady secret police organization, something like the Stasi in East Germany or the Nazi Gestapo. They may also know that Vladimir Putin served in the KGB as a foreign intelligence officer before he rose to power. They may have visited the KGB museums in Prague, Tallinn, and elsewhere. To put it simply, they get what the KGB was all about. Dictatorial regimes based on control and compliance need security bodies. They need their secret police. But the KGB wasn't the first of these bodies in the USSR. From 1946 up until Stalin's death in 1953, The Ministry of State Security, or MGB, handled these duties. And there were others too, in the complex genealogy of Soviet state security apparatus, primarily the Bolsheviks' Cheka that emerged in 1917 and the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, of the 1920s and early 30s. Today though, our focus is on what is probably the most notorious of all the KGB's many precursors. We're looking at the Narodny Komissariat Vnutrennyi Del, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, better known as the NKVD. For almost 12 years, throughout the turmoil of the 1930s, with its purges and persecution, and through the echoes of World War II, when the Soviet Union achieved victory from the very brink of defeat, it was the NKVD that ran the show, striking fear into the hearts of all outside their ranks, and many within. There are no names here. Lavrentiy Beria, for example, is perhaps second only to Stalin himself in the infamy stakes. And then there are shadier characters whose names and deeds are lost in the wash of history. Boris Rodos, for example, or Leonid Zakhovsky, who took pride in their torturous methods, and Isaiah Berg, who dispatched his victims with horrifying efficiency. Together, these men were embroiled in a world of mafia-esque one-upmanship, political positioning, and bloodthirsty ruthlessness. And most would die at the hands of their former comrades. As you'll see, men like Beria represent only the very tip of this terrible iceberg. At the surface, we have the best known of the NKVD men. These are the former leaders, men who orchestrated terror and suffering and who cemented their names and reputations upon the murder of others. And we're starting with the man at the very top. Born in 1899, Lavrentiy Beria was a Georgian compatriot of Stalin. After distinguishing himself as the head of Transcaucasian Soviet republics, he was transferred to Moscow to serve under Nikolai Yezhov in the NKVD. It would be here in the capital that his political ambitions would go into overdrive. Beria is at the very tip of this grim iceberg for two reasons. One, he was the highest ranking member of the NKVD for 7 years and is widely known as a result. Two, his list of crimes is staggering. Beria oversaw the last phases of the Great Purge, executing and banishing political opponents as he jostled for power. He put in place the infamous Gulag Archipelago, a vast penal network that swallowed up countless lives. He ordered the Katyn massacre, murdering hundreds of Polish army officers during World War II. He was known to use torture and murder for political gain. On a personal level, he was also known for raping countless women and even minors for his own pleasure. An even-handed view is always important when we examine history, but even the most objective view paints Beria as a deeply unpleasant and sadistic figure. The Soviet Union was not supposed to be an empire or a monarchy in the traditional bourgeois sense of those words. But still, the death of Stalin in 1953 led to a succession crisis, and Beria seemed poised to take his place as the next leader of the USSR. But with Stalin gone, Beria had no one left to protect him from his powerful enemies. The official line goes that Beria was arrested, tried for 6 days, and then hanged, leaving the way clear for Nikita Khrushchev, who had been a rank outsider, to take over as leader. Although some believe he was simply apprehended and shot by those who had grown appalled by his behavior. Before Beria, there was Yezhov. Serving as head of the NKVD for 2 years before Beria took over, Yezhov could be just as monstrous as his successor. The fact that the Great Purge is also known as the Yezhovchina provides some clue as to just how influential this man was in the mayhem that ripped through the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Only 5 foot tall and hindered by a malformed leg, Yezhov was known as the Bloody Dwarf by many. What he lacked up in size, he made up for in meticulousness and brutality. You do not need to check his work, one colleague noted. He will do it all. His only problem? He doesn't know when to stop. For a while, it may have seemed like Yezhov didn't need to know when to stop. He ordered the arrest, torture, and execution of his forerunner, Genrikh Yagoda, and he rid himself of all who got in his way. He was also a favorite of Stalin. He was untouchable, basically. One of the most famous images of the Stalinist period depicts the General Secretary himself beside the Moscow Canal, with Vyacheslav Molotov on his right and his beloved Nikolai Yezhov on his left. Later, the very same image appears again, but to Stalin's left, there's no one. Yezhov had learned the hard way that no one is untouchable. After falling out of favor with Stalin in 1938, Yezhov was denounced, then arrested, tried, and executed on trumped-up charges of counter-revolutionary activities. Images of him, like the ones we've just mentioned, were stricken from the record. It was on February 4th, 1940 that Yezhov met his end in the basement of an NKVD station in Moscow that had been specially designed for executions. Yezhov himself, in a final twist of irony, had designed the chamber himself. As Yezhov had been shot in a basement, rather than the main execution chamber at the Lubyanka, the execution was kept secret for a number of years. It was thought that it was Ivan Serov, a future chairman of the KGB, who pulled the trigger, although some believed it was Vasily Blokhin who held the gun. Whoever it was, Yezhov's body was cremated immediately. The man and his likeness were erased from history. Just below the surface, hidden from view, deputy commissars, regional chiefs, and high-ranking officials went about their work. The crimes of the men at this level are vast, but they're largely forgotten about by popular history books and general overviews of the period. Born in Narvsov, the Russian Empire, in 1898, Mikhail Franovsky was only 20 when he joined the Communist Party, and he quickly became a leading member of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. As Deputy People's Commissar of the NKVD, Franovsky was right beside the more famous Yezhov as a fellow architect of the Great Purge, ordering mass arrests and executions, and even personally overseeing the murder of political opponents, such as Abram Slutsky, head of the NKVD's foreign department, who met his end in Franovsky's own office. By 1938, Franovsky was highly thought of among the Soviet Union's upper leadership and was appointed to People's Commissar for the Navy. This goodwill would not last, however. In 1939, the new NKVD head, Lavrent Beria, accused Franovsky of masterminding a Trotskyist fascist conspiracy. Perhaps in the hope of saving his own skin and that of his family, Franovsky submitted a confession on April 11th and was arrested the following day, along with his 17-year-old son Oleg and his wife Nina Franovskaya. Despite his cooperation, Franovsky and his wife were executed on February 3rd, 1940, 2 weeks after their son. Stanislav Redenes was an enthusiastic party member, serving as head of the Odessa Cheka in Ukraine and overseeing the deportation and execution of prosperous peasantry in this part of the Soviet Union. This process, known as dekulakization, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions, of people deemed to be class enemies of the USSR. In 1933, Redenes was redeployed to Moscow, where he became the head of the NKVD units in the capital. Here, he was responsible for more purges, as Stalin sought to avenge the assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934. Redenes should have been safe. He was married to the sister of Stalin's second wife and was a recipient of the Order of Lenin. But in fact, no one was safe. Born in what is now Poland, Redenes's own background would put him in the firing line. He was accused of joining up with a Polish subversive spying group and arrested in 1938. On July 21st, 1940, Stanislav Redenes was executed by firing squad. 2 decades later, First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev would posthumously rehabilitate Redenes. Along with Mikhail Franovsky, Leonid Sokovsky found himself incredibly busy in 1935 as the Soviet Union's leadership dealt with the aftermath of Stalin's dear friend Sergei Kirov's assassination. Zhukovsky arrested, interrogated, and executed a large number of accused dissidents, and he was proud of his abilities. "Give me Karl Marx to interrogate," he is reported to have said, "and I could make him confess to being an agent of Bismarck." Zhukovsky was not only present in Franovsky's office when the head of the NKVD's foreign department, Abram Slutsky, was murdered, it was Zhukovsky himself who knocked him out with chloroform. Zhukovsky also interrogated and tortured former NKVD head Genrikh Yagoda, eventually forcing him to admit to numerous crimes against the Soviet Union, including terrorism. In 1938, Order 49990 extended the Great Purge to cover ethnic Latvians within the Soviet Union. This was a bit of a problem for Zhukovsky, as his birth name was, in fact, Henrik Stubis, and he was from Aizpute in present-day Latvia. Accused of organizing a Latvian nationalist movement within the ranks of the NKVD and being an agent of Polish and German counter-espionage, Zhukovsky was arrested and subjected to torture himself. With Beria now making moves toward the head of the NKVD, Franovsky got jittery about what Zhukovsky might have to say about him, fast-tracking his former comrade's trial and execution. Zhukovsky faced the firing squad on August 29th, 1939. Deeper down into the structure of the NKVD, we find the men who not only gave the orders but also got their hands dirty with the actual killing and maiming. Bodies like the NKVD need their elites, but they need their middle managers and soldiers out in the field too. When the higher-ups ordered arrests and interrogations, it was usually the job of other men to actually carry these orders out. One of these other men was Boris Rodos, the son of a tailor from Melitopol in present-day Ukraine, a shady figure who had once been expelled from the Communist Party after an attempted rape. Rodos went about this task with dutiful enthusiasm. He smashed Pyotr Zupov's knees with a hammer after his arrest following the failure of the coup in Yugoslavia. He beat the hell out of Nikolai Yezhov after the former NKVD head's arrest in 1939. He used torture to extract confessions of Ukrainian Communist Party and governmental heads Vlas Chuba and Stanislav Kosio, as well as Alexander Kosarev and writer and journalist Isaac Babel on the eve of World War II. When it was former First Secretary of the Siberian Communist Party Robert Ikes' turn to be interrogated, Rudos gouged out his eye. Rudos was promoted to Colonel of the NKVD in 1943, but was dismissed from the NKVD's successor organization, the MGB, in 1952. In 1956, with Stalin now gone, Rudos was denounced by Khrushchev, even being mentioned by name in the famous secret speech. Despite protesting his innocence, Rudos was quickly sentenced to death, a sentence that was carried out only a month later. The scale of killing during the Great Purge was so great that new and innovative methods of dispatch were required. The step forward Isaiah Isay Berg. Berg was credited with inventing a mobile means of execution, an airtight van into which poisonous gas could be pumped, extinguishing the life of whoever was inside before they even arrived at the firing range. Isaiah Berg oversaw a huge number of executions during the Great Purge and became popular in the party as a result. When 59 corpses were exhumed from one of Berg's execution sites in 1997, forensic archaeologists believed that all but 4 of the victims had been gassed. Berg may have been celebrated during the Great Purge, but the end was fast approaching for him. As Beria worked to root out Trotskyists from the NKVD and from the Communist Party, he found that Berg's name came up time and time again. Accused of inhumanity, which is somewhat hypocritical coming from Beria and his senior NKVD men, Berg denied inventing the gas van. It was the charges of terrorist conspiracy, however, that carried the heaviest penalty. On March 7th, 1939, Isaiah Berg was presented to the firing squad. He may have been spared a ride in one of his vans, but he would not escape with his life. Grigory Rapoport was born near Minsk in what is now Belarus in 1890 and joined the Communist Party in September 1918. In his youth, Rapoport, who was of a Jewish background, had been a member of the Pol Zion Party between 1904 and 1905. He would rise to become a leading Chekist in Ukraine during the 1920s. As head of the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, in Crimea for 18 months between 1928 and 1929, Rapoport oversaw the dekolokization of the region and would have been responsible for mass deportations and murders during this time. At the end of 1929, Rappaport was transferred to the Belarus military district. He later served in the NKVD in the Stalingrad region of Russia, but it seems he fell out of favor while in this role. On July 16, 1937, Rappaport was arrested and sentenced to death after alleged party disloyalty. This sentence was carried out on February 10, 1938 in Moscow. At the lowest reaches of the NKVD's sprawling iceberg, we find men who have faded into obscurity in the decades that separate us and them. Despite this obscurity, these men were responsible for heinous acts of violence and exploitation, and their stories form an important part of our understanding of mid-20th century history. Leonid Fakevich Bashtakov was born in 1900 and would have been in the first flush of youth when the Bolshevik Revolution came to Russia at the end of the First World War. By the 1930s, Bashtakov was ensconced in the structure of the NKVD, eventually rising to the rank of Major General in 1945, and later becoming Commandant of Higher Ministry of State Security MGB School in 1947. In March of 1940, Bashtakov received his promotion from Captain of State Security to Major of State Security. It was at this time that Bashtakov put together a plan that would make him infamous for his cruelty and callousness, the Katyn massacre, which claimed the lives of thousands of Polish prisoners of war. As we've already seen, it was Beria who ordered the massacre, but it was Bashtakov and his NKVD Troika, an executive group of 3 officers, who were its architects. Along with People's Commissioner for Internal Affairs, Vsevolod Merklov, and his deputy Bogdan Kobolov, Bashtakov drew up sprawling death lists that ran to tens of thousands of names. When these death lists reached the POW camps in April 1940, the extermination began. By the time the massacre reached its end in May, almost 22,000 Poles had been murdered. It's not clear precisely what happened to Bashtakov after the war. He retired in 1947 after a celebrated career in the NKVD and MGB. In 1955, as the USSR underwent wholesale changes after the demise of Stalin, he was arrested and imprisoned. Unlike most of the names on this list, and unlike the names on the list he himself drew up in the spring of 1940, he wasn't executed. Bashtakov died in 1970. Matvey Berman came from Chita in eastern Russia, joined the Irkutsk military school, and was serving as a cadet in the 25th Reserve Infantry Regiment as Russia's involvement in World War I drew to an end. By 1917, the winds of change were blowing, and Berman made sure he was on the right side. He became a Bolshevik and subsequently joined the Red Army in 1918. 11 years later, Berman cemented his grim position in the annals of Soviet history. He helped develop the Gulag system of prison and forced labor camps that have become synonymous with repression in the USSR. As head of the Gulag system, Berman used his ill-gotten resources to complete vast civil engineering projects, including the White Sea-Baltic Canal in 1933. By 1935, Berman estimated there were 740,000 enforced laborers under his command. This glory came at a price, however, and countless laborers perished over the course of these projects. In at least one camp, inmates resorted to cannibalism in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Berman did not escape the Great Purge. He was demoted to People's Commissar of Posts and Telecommunications in 1938 and was expelled from the Communist Party that December. His arrest came less than 24 hours later. Convicted of terrorist and sabotage conspiracy, Berman spent just over 2 months in the infamous Lubyanka prison before his execution on March 7, 1939. The idea of the cult of personality informs much of what we know about the Soviet Union and has given us larger-than-life characters like Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and Leon Trotsky, who may well have led the USSR in an alternate timeline. But the cult of control and repression is equally important. It's for this reason that Lavrentiy Beria, while not quite as recognizable as the 3 names we've just mentioned, is still pretty well known amongst people with a casual knowledge of the Soviet Union. It was Beria's NKVD that provided the mechanisms of control through which the party presidium could keep the vast expanse of the Soviet Union in check. But Beria wasn't the first head of the NKVD, nor did he act alone during his reign of terror at the head of Russia's premier security body. The NKVD was a monster with many tentacles, which reached into all aspects of public and political life. If you had party ambitions in Russia before or during World War II, then you had to deal with these guys. Make a misstep, and arrest, torture, and execution surely awaited you. It's little wonder that so many of the names we've covered today met their end at the hands of the very security apparatus they had served so loyally. The NKVD became the KGB, known as the sword and shield of the Soviet Union. During those tumultuous years in the 1930s and 40s, those who lived by the sword were very likely to die by it too. But what do you think? Is there another NKVD man you'd like to add to this list? It's likely there's someone we've missed. This was a sprawling and brutal organization after all. So let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.